Welcome back to the official Atari Games podcast. This is Jason here, joined once again by only, this is your first solo appearance, the Blue Ranger, Dan Amrich. What's up, Dan?
I didn't think that I had earned the right to come back a third time on the show.
Yeah.
I assume that the comment cards that people sent in were strongly Amrich positive, so I'm happy to be here.
People want more Dan. They can't get enough Dan. Now, I probably made the mistake of saying the Blue Ranger. What I meant to say was a Blue Ranger, Dan Amrich.
Yes, I am proud to. It's been a really interesting time for people that are joining us late. I work at Digital Eclipse. I'm a content editor by day, but since we just finished Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Rita's Rewind, or just released it, we're not finished with it. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I got the chance to be the voice of the Blue Ranger for this very arcadey style game. You know, not a lot of VO, but it was a huge thrill, something I wanted to do forever. So I never lead with, I got to be the voice of the Blue Ranger. But a lot of my friends have been like, they've been doing the like, that's my friend Dan when they play the game. So then, you know, it feels good. I'm very honored.
Yeah. I also tell every guest that joins, if it's not obvious, don't prepare anything. You don't have to do anything. But I led the last podcast description. If you read it, the one that was called Atari Feud, we played some games with, we put Micah, and Tim Lapatino against each other in a game of Family Feud. That was
organized. Oh, fantastic.
So if you haven't checked that out, please do. And I highly recommend doing that on YouTube. But I wrote in the podcast description, actually, because I write those, I was like, hey, like gameplay is coming soon. We have announcements coming and they will be coming soon. I promise. And I will be getting back on like streaming with developers and talking about the games and getting in depth, but that doesn't actually start yet.
Yeah.
We're recording this on January 14th. And I said, you know what? I need to get something. I need to do something. I need to get these files to John so we can process the podcast. Who can I fill an hour with? Dan, what do you And you so graciously gave me some time. So I figure I do a few of these one-on-ones, these interviews. I had I've done it with Tim. I've done it with Ethan.
Sure.
Larry from Night Dive. Like so many guys have done it. I'm like, why not Dan? Dan's always down to clown.
I am kind of.
So this one will be all about you. Because I know you could go. I just need to kind of wind it up and set you loose. It's perfect. But until we get to that,
yes,
let's just do the brief housekeeping. I've done the worst job of taking any notes because I've been in calls literally all day.
Yep, you're busy.
So join the Atari.
I don't think the audience knows how important you are. They have devalued you as a podcast host, but you basically run Atari. Like Wade calls you and says, "What do I do, Jason?" And you say, "Wade, we've been over this. I've given you the instructions on how to be CEO." Right? Like that's my understanding from on the West Coast of how the East Coast part of Atari works. Is any of that true?
No, none of that is true. Wade sometimes, not anymore though. He used to just like, hey, can I get a code for something? I'm like, yeah, sure. Wade and I have a great relationship though. I love talking to Wade. He still has my copy of Star Ocean, the Star Ocean 2 remake that they made. I let him borrow that back. He loves a good RPG, and I'm like, man, you got to play this. It's great. And then he talks about his favorite games of the year, and it was some Vita games. I said, respect to the Vita. I say that as a guy who's got his Persona 4 Dancing All Night Vita on the operating table, ready to go to replace 2 analog sticks.
Nice.
I just need to build up the courage to crack that thing open and make it happen. But anyway, Atari Discord, join it. It's down there below. The link to join the Atari Club Discord. Now everything is the Atari Club for Discord and social. So find the stuff. There's a podcast channel. You could ask me questions there. I check every so often. Leave comments in the YouTube chat, in the YouTube comments. I read all of those, and even the not nice ones. But I like the engagement. I appreciate engagement. Right? That's how it goes. Say hello. I've listened. Here's my comment. Review us on podcast feeds that allow it, iTunes and Spotify and others, I guess, that are doing that. Subscribe if you haven't done so. All the things. Check out all the games that we released last year. A lot of Digital Eclipse stuff came out last year between Power Rangers, Rita's Rewind, Tetris Forever, Atari 50 DLC. Oh boy,
2 packs.
So much. content has
We
come
had
out.
9 different releases last year. Like,
Oh yeah,
at the end of the
Wizardry,
year, I
Llamasoft,
Lamasoft, Volgar the Viking 2,
Volgar, of course.
one of our DE arcade titles that probably a lot of people don't realize, that we did a series of sort of short arcadey style games. They're all out on Steam, but we did Cupid. That was one of Dave Reese's one. He did that like as a Valentine's Day game. I was knocked out by the end of the year. One, I was exhausted, but also like when I went back and looked and went, my God, this was like the year of Digital Eclipse hustle more than any other year.
Yeah.
So shipping that's not normal. Shipping 9 projects from a studio the size of our studio is not sustainable. We have a more reasonable plan for the coming year, and it's already very much underway 2 weeks into the year. I've been in, as you have, many meetings and a lot of like, when are you going to have this done? And I'm like, I've just learned how to write 2025 on paper. You know, like I don't have all your content ready yet.
I was saying, so we got back on the 2nd, and so we had. I don't know if you worked the 2nd and the 3rd.
I did. I worked from home. I did some research, so it was really me sitting like on the couch with some books, which was the best way to ease back into the new year.
Yeah, I called those 2 days the on ramp. Like that's what that was. You know, we're just gonna slowly get into this. It's probably the best way to start the year, as opposed to like a full week. I remember having dev calls. I had a dev call with one of the teams, and we spoke on Tuesday. They just got back on Monday after 3 weeks off. And I said, so you got an update? Nah, I'm just kidding. I know you don't have an update.
Yeah. What did you do on December 27th? You know, nothing. Stayed in my pajamas, watched, movies.
Yeah. Well, Dan, you've been. I mean, there's not really much else to say. Look, we released a bunch of games last year. I'll link some top level Digital Eclipse stuff just because Dan's here, right? Starting with Power Rangers, so you'll see that as well. You were on that episode where we talked about that, but while you were on and we talked about the games that you work on, we haven't really talked about you. So, and this is why I didn't start with a. This is one of the reasons why I didn't say, "Hey, this is your title," and whatever. I want to get a sense of who you are. Give us the journey.
All right. Well, I was born very young.
Aren't we all?
I probably have one of the more unusual backstories. I gotta say, now that I'm older, I've started to look back, in the rearview mirror and go, I'm so lucky I got to do that. That's ridiculous. I grew up in New Jersey, which is to say I grew up outside of Philadelphia. That's how I generally would tell people that I was from Trenton, New Jersey, because you don't want to be asked what exit, right? And I'm not the only Jersey boy at Digital Eclipse. I want to call that out. We have a little alliance. But I grew up doing a lot of hammy stuff, musical theater. One of my favorite cocktail party stories is I am actually classically opera trained as a singer. People don't know or expect that from me, but I did have a private opera tutor for 3 years. So I did a lot of singing, a lot of theater, a lot of growing up. This leads into why are you able to do VO in Power Rangers? Because I actually had applicable skills that it wasn't just I'm the guy from the studio. Wound up falling in love with guitar. You may notice behind me, there are like 4 of my 27 guitars. And
there's a bunch of guitars back there.
There's a bunch of guitars there. My first really cool job out of college was working at Guitar World magazine in New York City at 1115 Broadway at the time. So right near the Flatiron. So I said, growing up in Jersey, New York is overrated. I hate New York. I'm never going to New York. Fell in love with New York. Started worked there for 4 or 5 years. And then had the opportunity to be full-time games press, like reviewing games for a living. So I did that in California for about 15 years. I was freelancing on the side in New York. Then, as many people do, when physical paper magazines started to go away, I jumped ship. I got an opportunity to go to Activision, work in their community section. Wound up coming to LA for that. Did not like being in LA at all. Came back to the Bay Area. Worked for Ubisoft for a number of years in community on Rocksmith, their video, learn how to play guitar. That was perfect. I mean, it was the intersection of guitar and video games in my history. 15 years reviewing video games and then, playing guitar my entire life and caring so much about that. It was a really good fit. I was there for 7 years, and then I came to Digital Eclipse about 2 years ago. It'll actually be 2 years ago This month? No, next month. I think it's gosh, I don't know. It's either late January or early February. So I'm right at the cusp of my 2 years at Digital Eclipse. But the funny thing is, so many people at Digital Eclipse I knew ahead of time. Chris Kohler, he's our editorial director. He and I have been friends for years. Mike Micah, I had known him for years. Tom Rousseau, our biz dev guy. All of these people also were magazine refugees. Stephen Frost, our head of production, he worked at PSM before he went to Activision and Sega and EA and honed his production chops. So we have so many people. It's almost like an old folks home for people who used to be in video game magazines. But as a result, we have a lot of shared experience. We all have our own specialties, but having that many people playing games as a career for that long really helps inform what we do on an interesting level. So I'm still a hobbyist musician. I'm still in a band. It's a very silly band, but I try to write songs. My wife plays bass, so she totally understands why I have 27 guitars. And so that's what I do. But by day, I work at Digital Eclipse doing the in-game content, researching Gold Master Series stuff, conducting interviews with people that I never thought I'd be able to meet. Some of my boyhood heroes. It's been really surreal to sit down with Al Alcorn, the engineer who created Pong, and ask him to tell me the Pong story for Atari 50. So I'm the invisible person on the other side of the camera in those interviews. And I'm just like, I can't screw this up. I can't screw this. Al Alcorn is in the room, and I'm fanboying out. And he's like, yeah, whatever. I've told these stories a million times, but I'm really grateful that he was able to tell those stories to us. It was very nice. So yeah, so I've been very fortunate that I've been able to have a lot of fun my entire career. And certainly I got to say, when Digital Eclipse was acquired about a year and a half ago, late November, and my email address is, at digitaleclipse.com, but now it's also at atari.com. The 7-year-old boy in me, unbelievable. If you had gone back in time and told 7-year-old Dan, you're going to work for Atari someday, you'd be like, none of my friends on the playground will believe me. That's an impossibility. That can't happen. Nothing could be better than the 2600. So I'm old enough to have actually grown up as an Atari gamer. So working for the company is actually a really big deal for me. Was that it? Was that the whole podcast? Do you need anything else?
No, I got a few more turns. I got to do hang on. I got to do a few more turns on the dial on the back. I thought you were going to go longer. Man, I got a few questions that came out of that. So first of all, what years were you working at the Flatiron area in New York?
Okay, that was right out of college. I started freelancing as a music journalist. That was going to be my career. My career goal was to write for Rolling Stone. And I was into guitar heavy, late in high school. I taught myself how to play guitar and I just fell in love with it. So I was reading all the guitar magazines and it occurred to me, who needs album reviewers or interviewers? Well, okay. And there were two in New York City, Guitar World and Guitar for the Practicing Musician, which no longer exists. And so Guitar World was... I was desperate. It was really a bad job market when I graduated in 1993. So by the end of that year, I had been freelancing for a while, and Guitar World was doing a spinoff called Country Guitar Magazine. If there's one type of music I did not care at all about, it was country music. And if there's one place you don't want to be doing a country music magazine, it's New York City. So they said, hey, I had done a few reviews for Guitar World, and they liked that. I hit deadline. I did all the important things that a writer needs to do. You need to be able to take feedback. You need to be able to submit clean copy, and you have to do it on time. There's no 2 days late. They'll never hire you again. So I showed I was one of those people that could do that. And they said, they called me and they're like, hey, do you like country music? I said, not particularly. And they said, could you try? And I said, why? They're like, well, we're spinning up this new side magazine, to Guitar World Presents Country Guitar, and we could really use somebody as a managing editor. Now, what I didn't know was that the managing editor is really in charge. It's a production role. You're the guy who herds the cats. You have to sync with the writer and the editor and the production team that lays out the pages and sends them to the printer. And you're supposed to be the traffic cop that makes sure everything. I am terrible at that. That's not in my skill set. So I learned a lot, but I did get that full-time gig. And I was working for Guitar World at the same time. I would occasionally write a small piece. Guitar World, the web was brand new, so I became the online editor for Guitar World. And I would work on, working on the back end of writing HTML by hand sometimes. So I did sort of a little bit of everything at Guitar World from 1993 to, I guess it was 96. So it was 3 years, but it was 3 really intense years, right? Like, I'm in my early 20s, I'm starting out. I didn't go to a lot of rock shows, but I got to interview a lot of really cool people, both in person and over the phone. But I was so green. And at the same time, I'm doing video game reviews and video game interviews because the company that owned Guitar World and Country Guitar also had a lifestyle magazine. We didn't call them lifestyle magazines at the time, but it was called Flux. And Flux covered video games and comic books and music, rock music, rap music. You would think, okay, a lifestyle magazine, I understand what that is. At the time, we didn't even really know what to call it. So it became very hard to sell because music, record companies are like, why do I want to advertise in a comic book magazine? And comic books are like, what do games have to do with what we do? And, like nobody felt like it was their magazine. Plus, like our audience was like the Beavis and Butthead audience. So that we were kind of angling towards juvenile delinquents who were more likely to steal the magazine than buy it. So it was a lot of fun, but I got to interview like Ed Boon and John Tobias about Mortal Kombat 3 and do a cover story on that. And I got to, play a ton of different games and I sort of made my reputation in the video game journalism, such as it is, and I'm using big air quotes there because to me, reviewing a game is not what like I would call journalism, right? I'm saying this game is good or bad, and here's what I thought about it. Whereas like journalism is like, we contacted local mayor's office and we found corruption in local government, like that's real stuff. And I'm just like, Dead or Alive has some pretty hot chicks in it, and whatever. So, but yeah, I was in New York for about 3.5, 4 years, and I just fell in love with the city the way a lot of people do. I was basically between Union Square and Times Square. That was it. That was my area because I would go up to Times Square for demos and stuff, and I would go down to Union Square to go to Toys R Us and buy action figures for my desk. I don't think Toys R Us is there anymore, but it was like right across from NYU and Columbia. Like it was right down there at the campus. So,
now the reason. Sorry to cut you off.
That was it. I'll go forever.
I asked a question of when you were there. This is like me, like digging for gold, and I hit like a nuclear warhead. It's like I did.
I'm sorry.
No, it's perfect. It's great because it leads me to ask the question. Because you did get there. I mean, I got there immediately, but I love it. I love this story. This is why it's so good. I'm like, this is getting exactly what I want because it's fascinating. This is why I think it's important to like understand the journey, the background, all these other things. Like, who are these people? They're fun. It's a cool. We got an interesting collection of people here. But really what I wanted to know was, how do you feel about Shake Shack franchise explosion?
Okay,
because you were by the original Shake Shack Flatiron at the time when it was the only Shake Shack.
I never went there. I never once ate a Shake Shack.
It's over.
No. Across the street from the Flatiron. So this is Madison Square Park, not Madison Square Garden, which is 10 blocks away. But Madison Square Park is a nice little, like, this is an awkward area of trees. So it's part of, like you can just go over there. There were bagpipers there. One of my life ambitions is still to try to play the bagpipes. And I got advice from that guy. And I said, I've got a bagpipe chanter, which is the part that you hold in your hands and you blow into with the reed. And then the bag is what you just sort of like inflate and keep it going. But the actual musicality is done with the fingers on this pipe, right? And I said, I've got this practice chanter, which is just that pipe part and the reed, and you can make a noise. And I said, it's not working. And I wonder if something's wrong with it. And he looked at me and he said, no, this looks fine. You just need to blow harder. Blow twice as hard. And then he gave me this look and he goes, maybe 3 times as hard. I'm not a big guy, okay? I'm like 5'5".
Yeah, this guy was lungs, like
6'2".
We got the opera lungs.
Yeah, but I wasn't doing it right. But I was just like, 3 times as hard. So that was across the street from the Flatiron. And next to the Flatiron was this amazing deli because it's New York. You throw a stone, you find an amazing deli. Like, for all of the cliches about New York, you will never go hungry in New York. So I would always just, I was always kind of like nervous too, and I was young. I was on a budget. I could get a massive sandwich for like $4, $5, and that might be 2 lunches, you know? So I would always just, I would default to, I would either bring in my lunch or I would go to the deli instead of going to Shake Shack. I don't recall there being a Shake Shack there in 93, but maybe it was, and I just wasn't aware. Maybe I didn't know how, like, if I had been aware that I could have gone to the original Shake Shack, that would have been awesome. But I was too ignorant. I didn't know. I went to the comic store, Midtown Comics, or not Midtown.
Oh, okay. So you were before it, because I guess the original one.
Yeah, it was on Fifth Avenue Comics.
Yeah. So yeah, it started in 2001. That's when.
Oh yeah, no. So yeah, this predates it because I was gone by 96.
There you go. So they booted out the bagpipe guy.
Oh, probably. I will say that when I first got to try VR, right? I tried an Oculus Rift. I was working at Ubisoft. They had some Rift games, and I asked to take a dev kit home just so I could, because I liked it. But I didn't know if I would stick with it, right? Like, I didn't know, maybe it's like a novelty, you know. I saw it as a game system. And so I hooked it all up, and I wound up falling in love with VR. I'm a big VR nerd now.
What was the first experience with VR?
Well, it was probably the game that Ubisoft was doing was Werewolves Within, which is the game of werewolf, One Night Werewolf, but with 6 people in VR. And it works incredibly well. It's not out for Quest. It's only out for Rift. So you have to have a PC that runs. I don't know why Ubisoft has not converted it over to the more modern VR platforms, especially given that they made a movie about it. And the movie is great. I highly recommend the movie Werewolves Within. It's super fun. But the definitive VR moment that really got me was I went into Google Earth. So Google Earth, you can go anywhere that they've mapped with satellite. And I just said, you know what? I kind of I miss New York. I miss that area of Madison Square Park and right in front of the Flatiron and right near my office at 1115. What does that look like? Like, what would that be like? So I typed in 1115 Broadway. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that particular intersection, but because the Flatiron is on a wedge and it's kind of a weird thing, there's another wedge on the other side that they've now turned into sort of like public seating, right? At the time, it wasn't. It was just like curbs, and it was an awkward way for cars to get around and stuff like that. Yeah. So it drops me in the middle of that, and I just started crying because I was right there. Like, it was 20 years ago, and oh my God, I'm right back in this place in New York that's very important to me. And it is very formative to me. And I just sat there, like, in the middle of a room with, like, you know, this giant thing on my head and two controllers. And I'm just weeping. And my wife's like, "What's the matter?" I'm like, "I'm in New York." You know? Yeah. So, yeah, I became a believer in VR from that. Ironically, now my wife works as a VR games developer, which is pretty great. So there's VR everywhere in the house.
That first VR experience is so special. Like, I remember exactly where I was. Like, what I did, it was CES, and it was at the Intel booth. They had it, and I remember just sitting down, and it was Eve Valkyrie. And they put the headphones on over your head. I put the thing on. This had to be like the first dev kit version, like DK1, I guess is that what it was called. And it was before Facebook bought them, so completely independent Oculus, that kind of stuff. And I was just like, wow, I've just gone from the most crowded, insane convention of all time, surrounded by TVs, right across from Hisense, which I never even knew existed until that year. And now I'm in space. Yeah. And I'm flying a ship, and I look up and I see other things around. I'm like, this is so cool. It's like that seated experience, like that complete, you know, sensory cutoff. It was great.
So I have to admit that my very first VR experience was the now legendary virtuality arcade game Dactyl Nightmare. Have you heard of this? This was a low poly 1v1 shooter. And it was something that existed in arcades because you had to stand on a platform that was about 5 feet across. It was a round platform. And you had about 30 pounds of gear that you had to put on, a vest, a belt, and a giant helmet. And they gave you a blaster, like a pistol, and then they drop you into the game. and it's just like a checkerboard pattern. There are videos of this online because people have tried to restore this game. But there's a pterodactyl flying around attacking both players while the two players try to shoot each other. So it's like a gunfight, but like in like a fantasy, spacescape with a dragon that's attacking you. I actually have a photo of me doing this at the New York Comic Con when I was there on behalf of the company that owned Guitar World, which also owned Harris Comics at the time, Vampirella, and they had the Creepy and Eerie, like the old horror comics from what was the name of the company? Not Harris. Warren. They had the Warren comic archives at the time. So I was like, I am dying to try this VR thing. And it was like $5 or something like that. But again, 1990s money. Oh my goodness gracious.
That's more than your sandwich.
That's a sandwich at the deli. Exactly. That's 2 days of lunch.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that was just, I couldn't believe it. I'm so happy that my wife took a picture, like an actual film picture that we had to take the photomat to get developed of me like this with all of this ridiculous gear to prove that I'm really OG VR, way long ago.
This thing looks insane. Like I'm watching this. It was 91 is when this thing was made.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This contraption you're in. I mean, the funny part is I love, and I'm sure you can also speak to this, right? Like as someone who does a lot of the editorial for the Gold Master series, like the times when people are figuring it out, right? Like, what is this thing going to be? Like, looking back at old platformers, right? And say, well, they were just figuring it out. They didn't know. They 3D platformers. Nobody knew how a 3D platformer was going to play until Mario 64 came out. And then you go back and play that, and you're like, man, it's good, but
right.
There's some questionable stuff. And I know it's great, but it's still like the way you turn, like you can't completely turn on a dime every time.
Right.
It's not perfect, but it was the best version of figuring it out. And that comes out, they revealed that the same time they revealed Bubsy 3D. And then at the same time, Bubsy's like, well, we got a D-pad to work with. And this is what our 3D looks like. And Nintendo's like, well, this is what our 3D looks like. It's like, everybody's just figuring it out. That's why the Atari stuff is so interesting. I love looking at UX specifically. Yes. And I was thinking about this when I'm thinking of VR game. It's like, cool, I'm in VR. And what do you see in the game? Your gun locked in place like a first-person shooter.
Right.
Which is very strange if you think about VR now, which is it's attached to your hand.
Right. Yeah. You think about it, and it's funny. One of the most rewarding and interesting things about working on Gold Master series and doing these deep dives into how did this game or this franchise or this person come to be the game franchise or person that they became is that you do get to see sometimes the blind alleys. You get to see the things that didn't work. Making of Karateka was a really great example of this because Jordan Mechner had created an entire asteroids-inspired arcadey style game for the Apple II that never actually came out until the making of Karateka, and we restored it, and then we did a new version of like, well, this is the refinements that a modern gamer would expect. So that was kind of cool, but I love seeing the failures. I think a lot of times gaming has come so far so fast that people are used to seeing perfection. And gaming is iterative. Game development, this is what I have really learned since going all the way in on the studio side. It's iterative. You try stuff, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. You try again. And sometimes that's internal betas. Sometimes that's the games themselves. Well, on the first version of this 3D engine, we decided to control the camera this way. The next time, we figured out that this is better off. And it's because you have to try to know. The British phrase is suck it and see, right? Like you have to attempt something. So when I see sometimes gamers get really angry, like, how could they do this? This is so dumb. How could you not know? Because you're making it up as you go along. You really are. And you don't know until sometimes these ideas have been tried by hundreds of thousands of people and have matured. And you start getting into the nitty gritty and you go, I see. So you have to kind of give game developers room to move and to fail to figure out what's going to work. After that, then it becomes an expectation. Oh, why didn't you do it this way? I was in a really interesting position when I was at Activision, the Spider-Man games. Or in my Stan Lee voice, the Spider-Man games.
That was pretty good.
Thanks. Yeah, I got a chance to meet him a couple of times. Fun guy.
Awesome. So which Spider-Man games are we talking about here?
We are talking about Shattered Dimensions.
Oh,
which
okay.
was, and then it was followed directly by The Edge of Time. And the same studio had done it, but they, for contractual reasons,
Right?
they kind of
Yeah.
needed to do a new Spider-Man game every year. So they were like, we're going to reuse the engine. We've got a different story to tell, but it wasn't received as warmly as Shattered Dimensions was, which was the first time that people really got to play in what we now know as the Spider-Verse. So you got to play a section as Ultimate Spider-Man. You got to play as Noir Spider-Man. It's a really fun game, and they got some really high level, heavy hitting VO talent to do all the different Spider-Men too. So the problem is that Shattered Dimensions came out 3 months after Batman: Arkham Asylum, which completely changed how people thought about a third-person action-adventure superhero game. The combat, the way that the combos flow, the slowing down when you deliver the final blow, all that stuff, that language had, like, Rocksteady was evolving that, and they tried that, and it worked, and everybody said, yeah, we want more of that. So when Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions came out, the team had made different decisions because they were trying their own way. And it was really disheartening to see a lot of the people say, but why didn't you do what Arkham did? Because in 3 months, you cannot change the entire combat system of a game. It's just not a realistic expectation. So I find that, like, a lot of times, I don't think that gamers know how much their favorite development team is making stuff up as they go along, is trying, is sucking it and see. And sometimes it just plain sucks, but you don't know until you try. um, you know, um, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Rita's Rewind just came out. We did something that I don't think we'll ever be able to do again, and I don't know a lot of other teams that frankly could do it. We put it out on the 9th, I think, of December. December 9th was the date, or December 10th. A week later, we had a balancing patch that addressed a ton of things the gamers said they wanted us to do. We really envisioned that game as you drop a quarter into a 90s coin op, and it feels like you're playing a 90s coin op. What I think we kind of misjudged was that a lot of the people that were going to play that game didn't necessarily want that level of authenticity. They wanted more flexibility. I want faster speed. Like the 90s games didn't move very fast. So they were like, why is this so slow? And we're like, oh, well, okay, that's something that we can change. And what about this? And what about this? And so we made some pretty dramatic adjustments to how the game plays and feels, even though it was true to the original vision of what we thought that game was going to be and should be. But when it came out, it was just like, well, we can pivot and people are going to have more fun if we do. So let's do that. So, people are like, how could you do this? Because we were making a game in our heads and you had a different expectation in your head. But you know what? I think we can come together, and we did. And it's been really nice to see, like, YouTube videos going, they changed it. It's so much more fun now. I love this game now. I was not into it last week. I was kind of disappointed, but I'm really happy to hear that they listened to us. And so, sometimes you can do that, but a lot of changes were made in the span of a week. And again, it just goes back to the idea of what kind of game is the team trying to make? Do they know what they're doing? And does the audience want what they are making? It might be an awesome 90s arcade game, but if the audience en masse says, but we wanted more modern features, okay, let's see if we can meet in the middle. Let's see what can we still make the game that we're proud of, and then, be able to adjust to what player feedback is. So we actually have a couple more patches that we're actually working on right now. I put a document aside. And we have some more things to do with Power Rangers in the coming months that you're going to see. You're going to go, oh, okay, cool. A lot of that is also based on player feedback. So
yeah,
there's a lot of
you mentioned
figuring it out as you go.
You mentioned the example of Shattered Dimension. That's tail end PS2, right?
Yeah,
because Arkham was a 360 game. Mm-hmm. It was not on 360 PS3. But I remember, so I guess Shattered Dimensions
was also on 360. Yeah.
Okay, so it was okay, got it. So that was early that gen, perhaps, or maybe came later.
Yeah, it was pretty early that gen. Yeah,
maybe 2008.
Yeah, and I think, what was it? The 360 came out, 2005, 2006?
2005. 2005 was 360.
So I guess the team
PS3. So yeah, I guess mid-gen, let's say. But that was a long generation. I guess that's why
it was. But I loved it. I'm a big 360 fan to this day.
But it was still before the time when I think patches were a regularly assumed thing. So your game was
Yeah.
done and that was it. You couldn't be like, oh, yeah, all right, we got some issues. We can fix that later. It's like, no, that's it. It's done. There's your game.
Yeah, if we had actually done Rita's Rewind back in the day, it would have been warts and all, but I think that also gamer expectations would have been different, because I hear people speak very highly of the Super Nintendo Power Rangers game, and when they see Rita's Rewind, it reminds them of that, because the gameplay, it's sprite based, it's like it's they're different games, but it immediately triggers. The best part was showing that game at PAX in Seattle this year and having a guy walk by, see Rita's playing on the big screen. People were playing it live, and he goes, "Oh man, I remember that." No, you don't. It's a brand new game. But I guess we hit the formula right,
Totally.
But
Especially that visual aesthetic. But I guess nowadays, because that retro aesthetic is something that has kind of applied itself to many modern games, people always expect those modern flourishes, especially I think because you get that so much. I mean, look at a game like Celeste. That's a great example of a game that is so pitch perfect in its 2D controls. You've never ever played a Super Nintendo game, which is exactly the art style it's pulling from, with that level of effects, that level of fluidity, that level of control, that level of interaction. It just doesn't exist. But to a layman, you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that looks like a Super Nintendo game. And you're not entering it thinking I'm gonna play a game from Super Nintendo that's just gonna constantly kick me down like the Lion King, right?
Right.
It's like, no, I'm actually getting a modern game with look at all these toggles I can flip around with,
right?
And whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things that Mike Micah always says is that we try at Digital Eclipse to make games that play the way you remember the games playing. If you play something like Celeste and then you think about your actual Super Nintendo games, all of your Super Nintendo memories are kind of colored by the fluidity that you get from Celeste. So you assume that actually those games are probably a lot better or a lot more fluid than they were. And of course, they mean something to you. So it gets a little bit romanticized, so they get even better in your memory. And that's cool. That's a beautiful thing, because we all connect with these things and they are important to us. But it does sometimes set you up for, man, we have to live up to literally unrealistic expectations. Right. The games were never as good as you remember them to be, but the feeling you had playing them, that is absolutely 100% correct. So we try to actually...
That's a good tie back to like Gold Master series and what it actually does, right? I think beyond other compilations of games, because a lot of these games you go back, like Atari 50 being a perfect example, right? And I say this being somebody who works at Atari, and go back and play those games, you're like, interesting, but no. I will play some of those games for more than 5 minutes time out of curiosity, but you're not going back to play them again and again and again unless it's like Tempest. But you're gonna find those games, but it's like, I don't know, you're lucky if it's like 1 out of every 20 is actually going to stick with you. So it's more about the context that creates them interesting, as opposed to presenting this thing saying, hey, play this thing, and you're like, I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I did see a lot of that in reaction to Atari 50. I've already bought these games 6 times, and besides, they're all terrible. And I think that that's unfair, but that was one of the things that we wanted to do was, why is this game important? Why would you want to go back? What's the lens through which you should see this to understand? Like, if you play Haunted House, that is still a really fun 2600 game. You need to read the instruction manual to figure out what it is. But then you start thinking, wait a minute, is this where Resident Evil came from? Is this the beginning of survival horror as a genre? And it kind of is. So having the context to understand, like, this is what they were trying to do at the time, or this was their constraints. We all know how difficult it is to program for the original 2600. And the creativity that was required to make the machine do things that it was never originally intended to do. So, yeah, I think that's where, I don't know if people know this or have noticed this, but we called it Atari 50, the anniversary celebration, because we didn't want to call it a collection. A collection is a list of games that you can play again, right? And we get that, like we've put all these books together. I have a collection of novels from this artist or from this author, or I have a collection of Steven Spielberg movies. All they have in common is that they are directed by Steven Spielberg. But when you sit down and you look at the games and say, well, this was what Atari this is where they were at the time. They had the freedom to go into crazy creative opportunities because they were the market leader. Or here's what happened when things went downhill and they had to go with more sure bets. So you see them like doubling down on sports because sports is, something that people always come back to, and there's a wide audience for it and stuff. So yeah, that context is really a lot of, that's why I got a lot of people say, well, can't I just get the games? Can you like sell that documentary nonsense separately as like DLC? Because I don't care about that. I just want the games. And I'm like, but you get both. And now hopefully you might play a game like Demons to Diamonds that you might not remember or have experienced originally. And now you have like sort of a contextual reason to go back and figure out why they made the game that they made, and whether there's interesting ideas there that you can see that were carried forward into other games. Demons to Diamonds, I think, is pretty underrated, and absolutely, when I bought my 7800 plus, the first game I plugged in was Ninja Golf. I think Ninja Golf is terribly underrated as a 7800 game. So I'm thrilled that like you can play it in an Atari 50. You can actually buy the reproduction cartridge now. You don't have to buy a vintage version. Yeah, but anyway, this was supposed to be about me, not about a Digital Eclipse. We talk about Digital Eclipse all the time. More about
yeah,
me.
I was getting
please.
there.
Yeah.
I was getting there. You are. I don't know how to tell you this, but you are guiding this conversation wherever it goes. You're the one who. I mean, I guess I did.
I'm a good loyal. I'm
Let me
a
ask you this:
loyal employee.
as we're talking about the Gold Master stuff, and you are responsible for a lot of that content.
Some of it.
Right?
Chris Kohler is really the guy who like has. He gets the credit. He and Mike Micah came up with this sort of like this template that we're exploring and now starting to evolve a little bit more now that we see that it works. But yeah, I mean, I get my hands dirty trying to figure out what do we say at each step of the timeline, and I did a lot of the deal. I focused on a lot of the DLC packs for Atari 50, which was difficult, more difficult than I expected it to be. Tracking down some of those details and assets and people and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. So what is it? I guess my question is like, what is the sandbox like in writing those things? What are the limitations, or is there anything that you ever say, hey, it'd be great to throw this in there, and they're like, yeah, we're no.
We start by having meetings with our engineering team. Chris is real good about saying this would be cool. Can we have that? Like, is it physically possible? Is it technically possible? And every project has its constraints, whether it's budget, financial budget, time budget, or human resources budget. All of those factor in. So sometimes we say, what's the lift from engineering? Does this feel reasonable? Yes, we have technology that's similar to that we can adapt, or you know what? I want to build that from scratch because we can use it on future projects. So a lot of the sandbox starts with what tools do we have at our disposal and what raw materials do we have? Are we building a sandcastle, or do we have a blast furnace? Can we make glass? It's that kind of stuff. And then Chris has done more of it. Chris was the lead on Atari 50. I helped out. I came in when that was getting underway, like seriously. So that was a great one for me to start with. Chris then had already done a lot of work on Karateka. People don't probably realize, but the making of Karateka was in development for about 3 to 4 years before it actually came out. He was lead on Minter on the Lamasoft project. And then he had all the elements for Tetris Forever, and that was put together very quickly. That, not to tell too many tales out of school, but the green light for that legally and like the whole contractual obligation stuff, that came through a little later than we were all hoping for it to do so. But Chris was like, boom, I'm doing it. That's how I sort of became like, please take care of Atari 50 DLC. You already know that product and you know that history but Chris learned that you start by just making a list of what happened. Literally, like not a timeline, but a chronology. Like, when did the company start? When did this person join the company? When did they get funding? When did this game come out? When did this console come out? What are the things that happened in between? Who came and went? What lawsuits were there? What life events happened to these people? And he said, and that's what I'm doing now on the next Gold Masters series title, which is not yet announced, but did get a green light at the end of last year. So we're all really excited and stoked. Is you build a chronology of what happened. And then he said, what I found worked and again, like this is a perfect example of we're trying different processes to find out what's the most efficient and what makes the most sense to get our head around the story that we want to tell. We come into these projects saying we think the story is going to be this. But a lot of times, once we get that chronology, then you go, well, that's a story. This is a chunk that we want to break out into the timelines. This is a really fascinating side story, a side quest that we need to go on. But for instance, the making of Karateka, Chris found that some of the most compelling narrative in that project was stuff that he didn't expect until he got his hands dirty and he started doing interviews, which is a little risky, but you have to listen to the story that wants to be told. In this case, it was Jordan and his relationship with his father, who created the music, who was his on-screen persona for the film that he wound up rotoscoping. That was his dad wearing his mom's karate gi, climbing up on the car. That's what became climbing up on the cliff. And sort of the long-term relationship between this father and son. This was a beautiful part of the story that you're not going to find if you just review the game, right? So with Goldmasters especially, we look for these human stories that might just emerge, that might just come up as you go. And so I'm open to that on this next project. I'm currently, this is when this happened, this is when this happened, this is when this happened, and I'm getting close to the end of having that full structure of all the relevant games and all the relevant titles and things that and the people that we're talking about being aligned, and then I can start saying, I think this is probably timeline 1, this era, then this is timeline 2, and so forth and so on. But then I get to actually interview some of the people that were involved in this history, and who knows what stories they're going to tell me. It was really fun to do most of the interviews for the original Atari 50. Chris was busy with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection. So he was just like, look, we've got the story, but the interviews to fill in those stories, can you do that? And I have history interviewing people, so that was a good fit. And I was like, yeah, I'm happy to help. But a lot of times people would tell me a story and then the camera would stop and they'd say, are you talking to so-and-so? And I'm like, no, I wasn't able to get a hold. I'll give you their number. And so you never, it becomes this almost phone chain of, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so because they know this part of the story that I didn't know. And so it became really good. And so you have to be open. That's part of the sandbox. It really is an open sandbox. What's going to happen? What footage are you going to find? Can you find like an old newsreel? There was a great example. There was a student film that people at UC Berkeley made in the mid 70s that wound up in Atari 50. And I think it's called Games Machines Play. But it's early on in timeline 1 of Atari 50. And it was a black and white student film that showed they went to Atari. Pong machines, like the arcade machines, are on the assembly line. It's that early in Atari history. And Nolan is there with the greatest mutton chops you've ever seen in facial hair. And they interview him and he talks about how computers are going to be, how we play games in the future. And Chris just happened to find this. And then he had to find the right people who owned it and then find out if he had legal permission to include it. Then we had to have the footage remastered. But that wasn't in the chronology. We didn't know that thing existed. Yeah. So awesome. It's that kind of stuff that you have to be open to. It starts with a guess. And, for this Gold Master series, I'm like, this is what I believe the core of the story will be. What is the narrative focus? Like, if you were going to sit down and write a feature about somebody, this happened a lot at the Guitar Magazine. I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to talk to this person about their new album. But then you wind up the conversation. It's like, oh, it turns out that this album is actually this person dealing with being a middle-aged rock star or getting back to their roots or getting over a failed marriage or whatever. And you realize, oh, that's what the story is that I'm telling, not just I got to talk to this person. So yeah, it's very fluid. It's very fluid.
Cool. Well, I'm watching the clock. So, but I want to keep this about you. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I'm going to ask you a handful of questions.
My ego needs to be sated.
Come on. 10 seconds or less to answer each of these. Okay, you ready?
That's impossible. I can't do that.
All right, here we go.
Do one that's 30 seconds.
No, 10 seconds each. Here we go. Ready? All right. Yes. Favorite rhythm game.
Favorite rhythm game, probably Guitar Hero 2.
Okay, done.
Because I spent the most time in that.
Perfect. Favorite Celtic rock band, knowing that you want to play the bagpipes?
I like Flogging Molly, but I also have a really soft spot for Black 47. They were the first one I heard.
Oh, I'll have to check those guys out. And what was on the sandwich?
The sandwich, I would generally get just turkey and cheese, very boring, but like lots of turkey, lots of cheese. I wasn't into avocado yet, but I would do like honey or Dijon mustard as well.
Perfect.
And no tomatoes. Right. I hate them.
And where can people find you if they want to follow you on social media?
I am most active now on Blue Sky. So I'm Dan Amrich. I'm basically the DANAMRICH, just one word, everywhere.
Links below. It's all good.
Yeah, cool. Everywhere, Dan Amrich.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Hopefully everybody who's listening enjoyed as much as I did. And I got to let Dan go. And hell, I got to go. So we will catch you on the next one. I promise the games are coming. There's so many games coming.
We're working on more games. We just need a little bit more time.
Thanks for listening. Bye, guys.